Welcome to the launch of the joint declaration of the Special Rapporteurs focusing on freedom of expression and gender justice. We're really just going to dive into this, given that our time frame is very tight. But before I hand off to Toby to give a little bit of a background and the purpose of the joint declarations, I just want to say that the conversation today will be structured around answering 3 questions. First, what are the key concerns and challenges for freedom of expression and gender justice, both online and offline? Second, what efforts are necessary to ensure protection of freedom of expression for women under international human rights standards? And finally, what are the recommendations from the joint declaration for states and other key stakeholders? So those are the questions we're going to use to frame the conversation today. So Toby, if you could quickly just give an overview of the history.
Yeah, so we lost a lot of time. I'm just going to make 3 very quick points. First point is that this process has been going since 1991, so I think it's absolutely fantastic that 23 years later, we're still going strong and producing these incredibly important declarations. Secondly, as someone who has accompanied that process since 1999, each joint declaration is unique in a way, but this one, I think, is really special and very innovative and unique. Mostly, we're addressing a specific freedom of expression theme, independence of media, fake news, whereas this one, in addressing gender justice, really somehow takes a cross-cutting look at all of the issues of freedom of expression as they relate to gender justice. So I think it's, you know, and other panelists will talk more, of course, about that. And the third point I'd like to make is how important, of course, I'm a little bit biased in that respect, but how important these joint declarations are. And I think the key there is that they represent very high-level standard-setting statements, you know, with the concurrence of all 4 of the special rapporteurs, focusing very much on, you know, standard-setting approach. And they often enter into standard setting in areas which other actors, courts, and other authoritative decision makers don't go into. And they're kind of pushing the parameters of freedom of expression. So I think it's a really unique soft law, as we call that, the approach. And I think it has really, over the years, advanced our understanding and indeed the scope of freedom of expression. And we see courts, other decision makers, academics, civil society organizations, I mean, relying repeatedly on these as kind of the only leading statements in those areas. So I think that sort of encapsulates a little bit the importance of them. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Toby. One of the things that I think we've all heard a number of times at World Press Freedom Day is the importance of women journalists and addressing some of the challenges that are facing people from a gendered perspective. And the joint declaration highlights both the challenges and the opportunities quite brilliantly around that. But I wanted to turn first to Carmen Aristigui, because when speaking about freedom of expression and gender and problems faced by women journalists, we've found that women journalists often face very unique risks, very unique gendered risks, from workplace harassments to online rape threats and physical attacks. Carmen, could you speak to us a little bit about your experience and the experience that you've observed in Mexico?
Thank you for the invitation to this forum. I will allow myself to make a prior comment before answering this question, and specifically to the subject. I would like to continue participating in the summit, in the World Summit for Freedom of Expression, without mentioning something that I believe should be brought to bear. In a day such as this, in a summit such as this, I think we should make a statement regarding a journalist in prison in Great Britain, and that justice has done everything for an extradition to the US. Because of the scope of this figure at world level, I think that in the summit we should have a statement. At least I make it personally. This isn't part of the meeting, but I think it's important not to leave aside and forget today, 3rd May, World Freedom of the Press Day, without mentioning this case.
por Julian Assange y su contribución.
Julian Assange and his contribution through the WikiLeaks and the many journalists, male and female, that have been persecuted and, in this case, convicted. I think that in this sort of summit, we shouldn't forget a statement in favor of his freedom. The issue of women and violence, both online and of other sorts, is extremely important, and I celebrate that the rapporteurs here present will make this declaration that they will later detail. But indeed, one of the most important axes in the discussion in this meeting regards online violence against journalists, and more specifically against women journalists. We're speaking of a sort of violence whereby we reinforce the strength of the attack against women due to their sexuality, due to their condition as women, because of what they say and do, and the manner how they look, the way how they express themselves, the condition of being a woman as an element to go against furiously through the social networks with the important aid of technology to viralize something that we experience in the world as women. There's this phenomenon, and there is a study that has also been debated in this summit, where it is demonstrated that there are many tools with the aim of annihilating morally and destroying the reputation and identity of journalists, but in this case, women journalists, using these elements I've just mentioned. And this forces a discussion at world level because of the impact it has on the democratic life, that it harms the tasks of journalists, but more specifically women journalists. When we look at the studies we've shared in this forum, that there are women that vis-a-vis this sort of aggression and attempts or achievements of moral annihilation decide to retire, to abandon the profession. And this begins to show us a sort of harm caused, of course, to them, but also to society and their right to know and have women journalists. As far as I'm concerned, as a Mexican journalist, and I said this in a panel in the meeting this morning, maybe it's hard to speak of this sort of violence against women in the digital spectrum in a country where they murder journalists. Speaking of online violence, when we have murders of journalists, maybe could seem even a bit shocking. But we must discuss violence throughout. All sorts of violence should be rejected, definitely, and understand also that verbal, digital, all sorts of violence can even lead to physical violence, and in extreme degrees to the murder of journalists. That's why we must reject it in all its dimensions and spectra. In the case of people such as me and the team of journalists I form part of, we could tell you about our experience in Mexico of several sorts of aggressions, censorship, judicial harassment, seizures of our facilities, and more recently, the sorts of violence recorded in the social networks. And this violence could be triggered by what is said or published or investigated, or because of what the political leader in your country says, a maximal political leader. If a president decides to pinpoint with a name journalists because they don't like their work, or because they believe that those journalists are part of what that president believes an oppositional position, if that president has a social basis or is popular, it could become a very savage thing in the network. And in this sort of context, the relevance is great. And unfortunately, this isn't really original, because we could count the number of countries where there are presidents acting in similar form. There is a modus operandi at political and governmental level that has placed, among others, the press as an enemy, and conceived as such, the message is conveyed to society, and society, a part of society, responds in a way that could admit that that is so, and that journalists are indeed enemies of a political project and therefore must be considered as such. So the phenomenon is extended. As I say, it isn't original for one country. There are several countries and high political level figures that have placed journalists and the media in a more vulnerable position.
Carmen, for reflecting on that and putting it in the broader context in terms of the threats that people are facing at the political level, which is often where this comes to. But Irene, just to reflect a little bit on that kind of broader context that Carmen has mentioned, it's not just about the issues facing women journalists. What are some of the other issues that kind of inspired the Special Rapporteurs to address this topic and include the topic of gender justice in the joint declaration this year?
Thank you. Thank you, Quinn. Let me start by pointing out that when you look at our declaration, it talks about freedom of expression and gender justice. And I want to start with gender justice because I think as Special Rapporteurs, Pedro, myself, Teresa, Topsy from the African Union, what moved us was the notion of gender justice. Going beyond equality, freedom of expression is a very powerful right, it's an empowering right, but women have fought, have gained a lot, but are also facing barriers and structures that go beyond the usual laws and policies that hinder freedom of expression for men. And therefore we thought what needs to happen, and governments and policymakers need to recognize that for women to have full enjoyment of freedom of expression, there must be transformative change. And gender justice is about transformative change. It is about looking at the structural and systemic barriers that stop women from participating fully in public life, whether as journalists, whether as politicians, or whether as ordinary citizens. And that also stop them reaching their own potential. So for women, yes, laws and policies matter. Discriminatory laws and policies have to go. But so must social discrimination, prejudice, bias, interpretation of religion, custom, culture that inhibit women from being able to express themselves fully, misogyny, prejudice. So let us look beyond law. And as lawyers, as special rapporteurs, we all have a great attachment to law and to international human rights law. But what we are saying here is that when we are talking about women's freedom of expression, then we must take a more holistic approach and address what we have said here is gendered censorship. That has to go. Inequality has to be addressed. So a broader approach has to be taken to break down the digital divide we have, to ensure women's full access to information, including, and today I say it deliberately given what is trending in the news, including to sexual and reproductive health, women's ability to express, freedom of expression in its full dimensions, sexual expression, gender expression, artistic expression, academic expression, all those various dimensions of expression have to be respected. So what we're looking for is a holistic approach here that goes down and addresses the systemic and structural barriers that are preventing us from achieving not just gender equality, but gender justice. And we do also recognize that although we are talking here about women, many of the barriers we're talking about also affect gender non-conforming people. So it's a broad approach to really fight where freedom of expression is not being properly respected.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Irene, particularly those words about fighting and fighting for what we know to be right in this particular instance. You mentioned a number of times the issue of the positive obligations on states to promote equality as one of the aspects that are touched on in the JD around this. So, Madame Ribeiro, I wonder if I could turn to you and ask you to speak and reflect a little bit on the idea of equality, particularly as it's heard and felt in terms of diversity in the media. I wonder if you could share some of your thoughts on that with us.
Thanks a lot, Quinn. It's a great pleasure to launch today this important joint declaration on freedom of expression and gender justice. But of course, I really regret not to be there in person, but unfortunately, it was not possible. Irene really, she really pointed out the importance of this joint declaration. Media freedom, freedom of expression face a growing number of challenges. Many of these challenges and concerns, anti-media sentiment and distrust, capture of information spaces, disinformation, safety of journalists, have been addressed by joint declarations in the past, and rightly so. Let's also be clear. But the issues related to the obstacles to the enjoyment of human rights and the risks of restriction, attacks, limitations that are greater for some in our society than for others has never been the subject of any of the previous joint declarations. A dedicated joint declaration to this horizontal issue approached in an holistic manner is innovative, and I hope it will be transformative too. Going to your, going directly to the question, we clearly need to address all the challenges related to this kind of discrimination, to this kind of horizontal systemic issue. A whole of society approach. States have positive obligations to ensure full enjoyment of all human rights, but also private companies, they have a responsibility to respect human rights, and the media and all of the society have to lead this kind of transformative change to remove the structural and systemic inequalities in view of creating fairness, gender justice, and enabling environment for freedom of expression for all. And this is very important. We need to address the structural barriers, inequalities, and discrimination women face at every step. Women have asymmetric access to power and rights. We see systemic obstacles which limit women's ability to exercise their right to freedom of expression. And we also witness distinct restrictions on gender issues, very much under the pretext of protecting public morals or following the paternalistic maxim of needing to protect women. And it's not a coincidence that setbacks on women's rights are very much linked to setbacks on democracy. So in the end, is a question of inequality and is a question of democracy. And to address these issues, we really need to mobilize a whole of government, whole of society, which means that civil society, private companies, and of course, the states need to be engaged in such a big endeavor. And thank you. I do not go beyond my time.
Thank you very much, Teresa, and for respecting the time. We are, by the way, trying to end at 5 minutes past the half hour. So for people who are keeping track of that. Julissa, if I could turn to you and ask you to reflect a bit on the issue of international and regional standards and the requirements to uphold those. There are, as people have mentioned, and as the declaration makes clear, there are existing international standards that touch on some of these issues. Is it a lack of standards, or the standards themselves insufficient, or is it the implementation of those standards that causes the challenges?
Thank you very much. And using my freedom of expression, I'm going to speak in Spanish. Bueno, yo creo que el problema o el tema que...
I think that the issue that we need to discuss goes beyond the dichotomy of lack of standards and political will. There are standards. There are plenty standards. And I would like to provide a very legal example. The Convention to Eradicate All Forms of Violence Against Women, signed in 1994, right? But violence against women has always existed. In 1969, the American Convention of Human Rights was approved, and that convention was enough, for example, using Article 5 on integrity, to interpret that violence against women was a violation to Article number 5 and eventually could be considered torture. So we didn't really need the standard. I mean, there are standards, and standards already existed. So I am very much aligned with what Irene and Teresa have said. I think that the main problem is understanding that discrimination and violence against women is not just a woman's issue. It's not a problem women. I celebrate that there is diversity here. Earlier, I took part in a panel to present a study on digital violence against women, and the audience was a majority of women and only 4 men. So what I said before, let me repeat now. If digital violence against women is so important, such an important issue and so necessary, why is it only women that are part of the audience? Where are the men? Where are the men to understand the problem? And in the second place, I don't know if everyone understands, or maybe it's feminists or women lawyers consider it is so clear and we repeat ourselves, but structural discrimination and ongoing discrimination about women. And there is a line, continuous line in discrimination that comes with us since we are young girls until we are older women. Sexual assault, for example, in most of our countries, the law, the standard, or provision that stated that if a woman was raped, if she married her rapist, he wouldn't go to jail. Well, that's been repealed, that's been eliminated. But older women, those in their 60s and 70s that had to live their entire lives with provisions like this in place, how do they carry forward? I always say that elder women today are those little girls that didn't have the chance to report these issues. So when analyzing violence against journalists, women, we need to look at this in a broader inequality and gender violence context. And we need to link all of those things that we have naturalized as part of violence. A very brief example. In societies like ours, where since we are children, we attribute different care or gender roles to women and not men, and statistically we can show that girls devote less time to their homework and schoolwork because they need to help their mothers. So those girls already grow with inequality in their lives. Speaking about access to information, as Irene mentioned, societies where women are not allowed to have access on their sexual and reproductive health that leads to unwanted teenage pregnancies. And of course, we should also consider sexual violation that it is already been proved that most girls and women suffer. So a girl is socialized to choose home care and household chores instead of school or education. So this perverse cycle of violence leads to women taking informal work, unpaid work, women who suffer higher levels of violence. And if she's not a victim of feminicide, she will reach her 60s and 70s without any pension funds, any retirement payments, because she's never worked in her entire life. So if we want to speak about violence against women, violence against female journalists, we also need to consider this in the context that we live in. This is an event about freedom of expression, but let me ask a few questions. What are women saying, but who are listening to them? Second, what do we do with this narrative that attacks women and are considered a joke or a cultural thing or something that people say? And something else to consider, Me Too movements, or I Believe You, Sister, that came about so women who had been violated or attacked at 5, 10, or 12 years and finally years later start reporting these violent attacks, and we've all seen hashtags on social media. But what have the answers been where they are sued for defamation? Now, criminal law that did not support you when you were a child and did not enable you to report these issues is then later on used to silence your voice. So that's why this declaration is so important, because there's a link between state, society, and private companies in fighting against violence. And we should be reminded of international obligations and something that I think is essential. Misogyny is placed in that hate speech that should not be permitted. Article 19, Article 20, in the civil and political rights says that we should not allow the promotion of war, violence, and racial discrimination. Now, can we allow those speeches that exert violence against women and promote violence against women? So it's not just a matter of political will. If I conduct a survey here, I am sure that most of your countries have ratified many of these instruments, and most of our countries have provisions in place that criminalize feminicide, but that has not reduced the rates of violence or feminicide, because we fail yet to understand that we need a transformation. We need more women in power, and to do so, we need to enable that, and we need women's voices and expression to start when they are girls. Mansplaining, or I will explain it for you, or I will do it for you, or when sometimes a woman wants to express her opinion, she's told, let me explain what you were just trying to say, which is what we're faced with every day, is that denial that women and girls are faced with all the time, and at the end of the day will promote and reproduce violence.
Thank you for raising the issue of silence. And it's the silence that's the hardest for us. We've had a really good overview of some of the issues that drove the need to have this joint declaration. But I'd like to turn now to some of the recommendations that are coming out of that as well to address some of these challenges. Pedro, if I could turn to you first. Where's your microphone? There's one somewhere. Okay. Pedro, if I could turn to you. And one of the recommendations have to do around access to information in particular. Is there something you'd like to kind of elaborate on that?
Bueno, en primer lugar, muy buenas tardes. Es para mí un gusto estar en este panel. Además, porque recuerdo que cuando estábamos haciendo el lanzamiento de la anterior declaración conjunta con Irene y con Teresa, que estábamos en Washington, hablábamos sobre cuál podría ser el siguiente tema de la declaración del año 2022. Y agradezco también el liderazgo de Irene, que sugirió que enfocáramos esfuerzos en esta declaración, porque además en los varios años que tiene esta declaración, nunca se había tocado de forma tan detallada la libertad de expresión de las mujeres. Y en ese sentido, para mí ha sido un privilegio.
It has been a privilege for me, and of course, men have privileges being part of this team that has written the declaration. There are 4 key issues highlighted in the declaration. A relationship between access to information and empowerment of women that includes specific obligations on closing the digital gap. For example, access to information and the internet to be available, open, safe, eliminating political and economic and political barriers that impact in a differential way on the possibility of women for expressing themselves. Second recommendation posed in our declaration regarding access to information regards a specific view of states and tech companies, internet intermediaries, to drive digital literacy measures geared to the right of the freedom of expression by women and girls. The third item is essential and has been previously mentioned elsewhere, and that's access to information for women and about women and of interest for women, including access to information about sexual and reproductive health, on employment opportunities, and all matters of interest and impact for women. And the last recommendation in the set regards the proactive role of states to produce data to better understand these situations, to gather information and produce statistics enabling a better understanding of the advancement of these obligations.
Especially thank you for, I know, shortening your remarks given the short time frame that we have available. I don't mean to silence you, but I think the economy of time is appreciated. Irene, again, taking off some of your earlier comments, there are also some specific recommendations on online sexual and gender-based violence. Would you like to elaborate a little bit on those recommendations?
Thank you. Yes. Sexual and gender-based violence is addressed in the human rights system from various ways. But when you look at it from the perspective of freedom of expression, in my view at least, it is the most egregious form of censorship. Violence is often used to shut women up, to silence them, in addition to silencing them from reporting. So violence in itself is a means. And online violence, of course, becomes a very powerful means of silencing women, ordinary women who are confronted with rape threats, smear campaigns, and so on, but also women who are powerful, journalists, politicians, human rights activists, who are sometimes forced to go offline. And in today's world, going offline means you are silenced. And here, of course, companies, social media platforms have a very important role to play because they hold the tools that promote this kind of gender hatred, gender violence, and they need to step up and make online spaces safe for women. What is unlawful in the offline world, in the physical world, what is unlawful in the physical world should not be lawful, should not be permitted to thrive in the online space. So companies there have to step up. I would also highlight something else. Very often, the discrimination, the violence, the threats that women face are also encouraged by media. We haven't talked much about media outlets here. And we are, of course, quite rightly point out the responsibility of digital tech. But in the good old-fashioned media world, too, there needs to be much more awareness and action to remove discrimination against women and attacks on women that actually then silence women. Equality of women in the media sector itself, as journalists, as editors, as managers, is important, but also how media reflects women, stereotyping of women in the media, for example. When we look at experts that media invite, how often do they invite women as opposed to men? So I think there's a huge responsibility here that media companies also need to be aware of. And then, of course, comes, most importantly, the state. And the state's responsibility in this area is a very particular responsibility, directly to prevent violence by the state, but also to ensure the non-state actors, whether they are social media platforms, whether they are media companies, whether they are religious leaders, community leaders, and other non-state actors, the state has a responsibility here to address violence, because violence is a very common theme through women's lives. Now, the challenge for us as freedom of expression champions is, where do you draw the line between violence, gender-based violence that is unlawful, between gender-based hatred that is incitement to violence that is unlawful, and offensive speech, which we say offensive speech is acceptable. Now, that's a very difficult line to draw, but I think for us, I hope certainly, that this declaration will be examined by regional courts, by jurists, by lawyers, by national courts, and that certain standards will be set as to what is permissible and what is impermissible when it comes to attacking women online or in print. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irene. And thank you for also pointing out that we shouldn't let as you said, the good old-fashioned media outlets kind of off the hook here. I think one of the things that some research I heard earlier is that 2/3 of women journalists have experienced some form of harassment and discrimination in the workplace, and that clearly includes the print and broadcast outlets as well. But to turn maybe to you, Teresa, to quickly kind of reflect on the role of digital platforms, particularly related to human rights due diligence. I mean, some of us may be aware of the Digital Services Act that's now come out in Europe, which has a lot to say around the responsibility of the platforms. What do you think are some of the recommendations that are coming from the joint declaration that really speaks to this role of the platforms in this space?
Thank you, Quinn. First of all, I would like very much to highlight, because I think this is very important too, that in the last decade, digital technologies have provided a lot of opportunities and new spaces for expression. And this is really, they gave voice to those who previously were without voice. And so all this must and should be very much highlighted. But the problem is that the online ecosystem has equalizing characteristics, but at the same time is heavily gendered. And that's the problem, which means that, which entails, of course, distinct challenges if the human rights and gender perspective are not considered, and I'm talking about data set, design, development, deployment. So in all the different phases, the human rights and gender perspective are to be considered and are very, very important if we want to have an online and space that really respect human rights. I would say that this is the most important. But I also would like to link to something that Toby and now Irene highlighted, and which is precisely the importance of these joint declarations. They're soft law, but can have an impact on courts and frame and set the standards for the future. And I think this is one of the main aspects of these joint declarations. And I hope that we can continue producing on a yearly basis these joint declarations, because they really advance progressive standards. And I think it's the case of this one. It's really putting the bar high regarding the need to consider a gender perspective when looking at the access of women to freedom of expression, the enjoyment by women of human rights.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Teresa. I want to switch gears a little bit now and focus on another area that's touched on in the recommendations, which is the relationship of gender justice, freedom of expression, and women's political participation, particularly given that women politicians are probably disproportionately targeted with gendered disinformation. Julissa, how do you think this impacts women's ability to actually desire to enter the political space or to enter the public sphere?
Gracias. Thank you. When I was listening to this panel and others, this issue of women's participation in the political ambit. And people have always discussed, and I agree, that women should participate at political level because this is an essential part of democracy. And my first thought for following Karen Pateman is that democracy is not limited to the public ambit, but also the private. What is personal is political. So while inside families we have gender divisions with different burdens for women in the caring tasks, for example, on the one hand, we're biasing destinies for the political ambit and the public ambit, and then harassment, violence, online harassment, insults discourage women to participate in politics. And people often say, what can we do to empower women so they participate politically in spite of abuse and misinformation? And my answer is always, why do we want women, apart from everything at personal level, harassment, violence, less access to retirement pensions and so on, participate in this ambit that we acknowledge as discriminatory and violent? Why don't we pay attention to that ambit? If everybody here agrees that it's a very an ambit that excludes women, why don't we work to change that space? Because if we don't do so, we're demanding heroic conducts from women that we're not demanding from men. And I think that's an important starting point. And to link with what I said before regarding private and public violence and online violence, I wanted to remind you of a well-known case, Olympia Corral Melo, a Mexican young woman that at 18 years of age recorded a sexual video with her partner that made viral. It was the recording was consented, but not the viralization, the uploading. And Olympia tried to commit suicide on 3 occasions. And when this sort of thing occurs, and well, we have had the Olympia law now in Mexico, but the question I would now make is, and who did viralize that? When you receive those images in WhatsApp of bodies of women and they are made viral, it isn't just because there's a prior stage where this is naturalized. We didn't tried to find out who was responsible for the virilization. Punishment was for the woman who had consented something that pertained to her intimate and sexual life. And that is another example of stereotypes that prevent women from participating in politics. So the first idea is to change the space.
In the second place that I would like to stress, the quota and gender parity laws are means. They are not an end itself. It seems like when states pass quotas for women to participate, they've done it. It is enough. You have your quotas. Now, what we should aim for is social transformation to promote the participation of women. Another element that I always stress is the need to establish zero tolerance policy, zero tolerance to violence, not just domestic violence, but institutional violence as well. That means that women, when they want to present their candidacy, when they're attacked, maybe the harassment that they suffer that are facilitated when no reporting is allowed or when the perpetrators are not punished. Also, there's an important element that goes beyond, and it has to do with violence, but I don't know if everyone is aware, is that running a political campaign is expensive. It is expensive. And women have fewer access to financial means. So how are they supposed to fund a campaign? How will they do so? And finally, but I think it is one of the most important aspects, in all classes, conferences, people tell me, how come women don't participate? Why don't women participate? And Carmen and I were discussing this earlier. Our countries show high rates of feminicides. So there are many women who do not participate because they've been killed, number one. High rates of women and girls who are forced to have children and are raped, and they are forced to have those children that are product of that rape, and they do not participate because they're forced to become mothers. So it's not just about regulatory framework or quotas or just a legal transformation. I am a lawyer. I really value jurisprudence. I think that all of the cases of the court and the reports of the commission are extremely valuable. But unless we understand that it is not a matter of women problems, but it is a matter of human rights, things are not going to change. And I am speaking about feminicides. Many times we say that women who were murdered, this is a result of feminicide, right? But who have to care for those who are left without a mother due to feminicides? We have high rates of female murders. So what about those children? What about those boys and girls whose mothers were killed by their father? Who's taking care of those children? Grandmothers, grandfathers? How many generations of violence we're going to reproduce? And we still expect women to participate in politics and do not expect transformations? I think we really need to reflect on that.
Julissa. And taking on that topic of violence and thinking of the context we're doing this within World Press Freedom Day, Pedro, I wonder if I could turn to you for maybe some final thoughts. I don't know, microphones around. One of the things that the special rapporteurs have routinely talked about is the protection of journalists in the face of pretty significant attacks against them and impunity. And we've seen states, despite the UNESCO Plan of Action for the Safety of Journalists, continually struggle with this idea of how do we protect journalists. Are there any positive examples or suggestions that you have coming from this declaration and others as to how to address this?
Bueno, creo que hay dos partes de la respuesta.
I think there are two sides to this answer. The fight of women, of female journalists, and even the Global Action Plan of the United Nations does adopt a gender perspective. So it has made it possible for civil society or for states in general to speak about the issue, to raise awareness on the issue. We have former rapporteurs here, Aido and Bertoni, who have helped develop some of these standards. I myself had to work in some of these cases, and I think that the recent sentence of the Inter-American Court in the Chinetti Osha case, where part of the working group promoting this case, I mean, there are several members of this working group here today, and the fact that the Inter-American Court has not only condemned the state in this case, but also eliminated and repealed standards on the prevention of violence against women who suffer violence because they are exercising their freedom of expression is very important, besides the obligation to prevent impunity. Now, going back to the declaration, which I also think it is very important, and to stress the declaration, because part of this protection to female journalists that addresses this declaration has to do with the third-party or intermediary companies for internet service providers. And I celebrate that we have members of the industry and technology companies here today. And this declaration calls upon platforms to be especially aware on how their services, automated processes, algorithms, and business practices could potentially promote gender stereotypes. And in this case, we could promote part of this violence. We are calling upon states, platforms to make sure that content moderation practices do not promote further discrimination, which is basically what we're trying to fight against.
All of the panelists, unfortunately, I think we've run out of time, which I think is, again, unfortunate given the richness of the issues that you all have raised and the deepness of the dialogue that could continue. But just want to say for those who've joined us, thank you for your patience with all of the technical delays and for sticking with us. The joint declaration is available online. I believe it's now been released during this session. Please do take that, keep the dialogue going, and look at the recommendations and look at the ways we can implement this to have a better environment for the safety of women journalists going ahead. Thank you all, and look forward to speaking with you further.
Thank you.